Putin, Russia, Ukraine, NATO, America, Biden, those are the words that have been buzzing in our heads since the morning in that order. So, Putin most of all. And as we have been guessing over the past few days, this has upended the world order. We said if war breaks out, if Putin launches war, actually it's wrong of me to say war breaks out. If Putin goes to war, as he has done, then this upends the global order as it came into being after 1945. That has happened because what he's done right now has put a big question mark on the power of NATO, has put a big question mark on who is the Dada in Europe. We thought that question mark had been erased in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. It has also raised a big question mark on what does the UN stand for, or does UN matter, or has it become almost as irrelevant, I'm being careful to say almost as irrelevant as say the League of Nations. Because if I emphatically said that, then somebody might draw the conclusion that the rest will also follow. We don't know. Also, we wish that the rest does not follow as it happened by way of the Second World War. We do hope that wise counsels will prevail and something will happen. So, Putin has carried out his threat. It's also one of those sort of unprecedented moments when Western intelligence, particularly the CIA, have turned out to be absolutely correct. So far, they had built a reputation of making wrong predictions like weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or not finding out what was happening on many things, on not just North Korean missile tests. North Korea is a closed nation, but even India's Pokhran 1 and Pokhran 2. But in this case, they've been right on the button. They've got it right and Putin's proven them right. Now, what happens from here on? First of all, Putin. Now, we have to understand who Putin is. He's the most memed politician in the world. More memes are made about him than about anybody, I would say, than even about Donald Trump, because after all, Donald Trump was president only for 4 years. Putin has gone on for more than 2 decades now, and we don't know how long more he'll go on for. But he's taken his most audacious step. He has used military in the past in Georgia, in Chechnya, which is his territory, Chechnya, in Syria. But this use of military against one of his former republics, which is by way of population, is the second most populous republic to come out of the old Soviet Union. This is a very significant step because this is also on his western edge. It is the western edge of what used to be the Soviet Empire earlier, or the western edge, what is now Russia, but it's also the eastern edge of what NATO sees as its new area of influence. As that happens, what is his off-ramp, as the Americans say, which means at which point can he get off the ramp, declare victory, right, and come back with his face glowing and to his people saying, look, I had said I will put Ukraine in its place, I have done so, I am back home, I've installed there a regime that I want. Now, will he go that far? If you heard his speech in the morning, he suggests that, because he's not saying I am there to protect these two so-called republics in the Donbas area, or to even recover the territory that these two so-called republics consider to be their own. He's not saying that. He's saying that I want regime change in Ukraine. I want this militaristic and neo-Nazi. In fact, he's not even used neo-Nazi. He said I want to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, which means he wants regime change, or maybe he even wants reprisals against the current democratically elected government because they dare to look him in the eye. So that is what's been going on. Now, has he taken too much of a risk? Now, there's a lot of reading coming out right now in the world press from experts, and I will quote one from Bloomberg. So this is in Bloomberg that we published just now, and you can check it out on our website as well, ThePrint.in, and this is by Clara Ferreira Marquez, and she says that what Putin has done is a combination of hubris, paranoia and military adventurism, because in his speech he also said that we were weak when the Soviet Union collapsed, we were weak when Yugoslavia broke up, so that allowed America and other European powers and NATO to come in and settle those issues. Then he said that even in Iraq, we were weak, but now we shall no longer be weak. So basically to say that Russia is making a comeback. But she says that there is always a possibility that he have made his final fatal move. And she quotes from an American scholar, Daniel Treisman, who is a professor of political science at University of California at Los, who also heads a kind of Russia study group consisting of a large number of thinkers, watchers of Russia, and whose most recent book is Spin Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century. And he says that, look, there is something called an autocrat's trap, and it is possible that Putin is walking into that. An autocrat's trap is that a dictator, as he becomes more and more powerful, surrounds himself even more with a bunch of people who all tell him what he wants to hear. Nobody gives him a reality check. And you saw some of that play out in that National Security Council meeting that Putin held, where if anybody said something which he didn't want to hear, he publicly upbraided them, knowing that he intended to telecast this to the whole world. So when you put yourself in a cocoon like that, then you make many mistakes because nobody is telling you, sir, don't do this. And one day you make your last final mistake which leads to your downfall. So it is possible, she says, that Putin is heading in that direction, because an autocrat's trap is when you start not seeing the facts, you start making policy not based on facts or realities, but on your fears, and people around you only exacerbate those fears. For example, in his speech, he said that Ukraine is Lenin's invention. Now, he may get away with it right now because he's got total control over his population, and nationalism is very heady for any country. And Russia has a strong history of nationalism. So he's bringing that back, and that pride back. Also, his economy in terms of his reserves and all is not doing so badly, and I will talk in little more detail about that. But he has an under-vaccinated population, highly under-vaccinated population. He's had very high COVID fatalities. His economy is not growing. He has the reserves, but his economy is not growing. So he has many vulnerabilities as well. So she invokes Daniel Treisman to ask if this is the autocrat's last act. Now, it is or it is not, we don't know, because at the same time, while he's being hit with sanctions, the fact is that his debt to GDP ratio is nothing. Russia's debt to GDP ratio is just 18%, right? America's, just for comparisons, and I know that there are many qualifications there, America is 133% of their GDP, of a much bigger GDP. The big difference is that America, unlike Russia, prints the dollar, which is the world's reserve currency. So the whole world comes, buys American bonds, and thereby subsidizes or underwrites America's deficits. Russia does not have that luxury, but the fact is 18% of debt means nothing. I will also refer you to an article that my friend Ruchir Sharma had written in Financial Times, catches columns in Financial Times. He's among the most astute writers on global affairs right now. So read his article from 2021. This is towards the end of March 2021. He wrote an article in the Financial Times where he said this, that is a year ago. He said that, look, one, Russia knows how to deal with economic hardship. So 1989, ruble collapsed as Soviet Union collapsed, and then twice again ruble collapsed in 1990s, and then again 2008 with the global financial crisis. As we know, the ruble has also declined over the last several days compared to dollar. But he says that, look, Russians now know how to deal with it. Russians also know how to live with it. He writes that Putin has converted Russia, has rebuilt Russia into an economic fortress, because he realized after 2014, when he invaded and took over Crimea, and sanctions hit Russia. In fact, sanctions hit Russia like a double whammy at that point. How? One, he was hit by these sanctions, and second, global oil prices collapsed. As global oil prices collapsed, that is the main source of income for Russia. So that also went down and really suffered. Since then, he has invested time, emotions, skill, money into building Russia into an economic fortress so he can survive the next round of sanctions. So again, Ruchi writes in that article that he's been the opposite of Erdogan. You've seen Erdogan go the way of completely unorthodox economy and fiscal and monetary management. You've seen Putin's Russia become totally orthodox. And that is what has placed Russia on a firm ground right now. I told you 18% of GDP as debt compared to America's 133%. Of course, they can print the dollar. It also has the highest government surplus among emerging markets, emerging countries, fourth highest current account surplus. In fact, when I see CAS, I wonder what is CAS, because we are so used to only seeing CAD, current account deficit. But Russia has a sizable current account surplus, fourth highest among emerging countries, fourth largest foreign exchange reserves, today upwards of $600 billion. It's a lot of foreign exchange reserves for an economy which is about little less than two-thirds the size of India's economy, albeit on a much smaller population than India. Then his short-term foreign debts, the debts you might have to return immediately, because one of the first sanctions is that they will no longer have access to sovereign debt. But their short-term foreign debt is less than 10% of their foreign exchange reserves. So that means nothing. They can deal with it. The only thing that might hurt them is that if oil and gas prices collapse, but that is unlikely to happen right now, because the Western world, particularly America, for its own reasons, has already hit Venezuela and Iran, the two big hydrocarbon producers, with sanctions. So unless they lift those sanctions, there is very little chance that global oil and gas prices will collapse, and that is why he feels secure. In fact, just for comparisons again, while his foreign debt is less than 10% of his GDP, for most emerging economies it's in the 30% range. So he's really prepared for these sanctions. The next thing I want you to read is an article by Gideon Rahman, who is my favorite and who is one of the finest columnists on foreign affairs, experienced with long years of distilled knowledge. So he's done like an instant insight on Financial Times, and I'll share a link with you, where he says, look, phony war has ended, real war has begun. And then he says what this might lead to. He says for Russia, this will enable now Putin to finish all remaining vestiges of any freedoms. So he will become now a full-scale classical dictator of the kind that Russia, maybe I'm adding this, that maybe Russia hasn't seen since Stalin. Gideon has not written it, I'm adding this. And second, he says that while sanctions may hurt Russia, and Russia may be willing to take the pain, but this will hurt the European countries because they'll be denied both the gas and the markets, and this may lead to unemployment and recession there. So is everybody willing to pay the price? So this in a way is a world changing development. Now what am I doing? I know that all of you are watching live what's happening in Ukraine, right? All of you are also getting gyan from a lot of much bigger gyanis than any of us here. So I read from people, I listen to people, and I distill from them. So one of the things I noticed was something that our Air Chief said today, Air Chief as in Air Chief Marshal Chaudhary, and he was delivering a lecture at Jambo Majumdar International Seminar. Who Jambo Majumdar was, I'll tell you as an aside in a minute. And this was a speech at Center for Air Power Studies in Delhi. And he used a line there which is very important if you look at the way this battle or this war is now unfolding in Ukraine. He said, targeting critical infrastructure and distributed denial of services has changed the way wars will manifest, right? So you go for critical control points, you go to communication nodes, you go to air defense centers, you go to armed forces command and control centers, you use a combination of cyber and physical to make a country's electricity go on the blink, right? That is how modern wars will be fought. And because I told you that I will tell you who Jambo Majumdar was as an aside. Jambo Majumdar is one of the most legendary pilots of Indian Air Force. His full name was Karun Krishna Majumdar. He was the first Indian pilot to rise to the rank of Wing Commander in Royal Air Force. He participated in many operations both in Britain and Burma, and then also in Northwest Frontier Province. He got a Distinguished Flying Cross and a bar as well, and he unfortunately died at a very young age of 31 during an aerobatic show in Lahore. And in fact, Life magazine in its May 15, 1944 edition did a story on the world's 12 most outstanding airmen, and he featured there. So after that fascinating aside, we come back to the track and again on Ukraine, and we look at what lessons are now available already. One, as I told you earlier, the post-1945 world order now is over. Second, Putin has shown, and before that China had shown a little bit, that hard power matters. Because for a long time, everybody had begun to believe that it's economic power, etc., that matters, not hard military power. Now, Putin has shown that hard power matters as long as we show the willingness to use it and to incur the costs and risks that come with it. And that has now changed the calculations of everybody. Third, while he's used it, he also will realize someday that hard power has its limitations. And you might say, oh, we don't go by the American example. They are a soft state. That's the reason they ran away from Vietnam and they ran away from Afghanistan. But remember, in 1989, it was the Soviet use of hard power that not only led to defeat in Afghanistan, but also led to the breakdown of the Soviet Union. So those are the risks that come with hard power. The next lesson is an old one, and that is that both world wars as yet, World War I and World War II, started because of conflicts within Europe and because of the inability of some important European states to look after their own defense. They were not Atmanirbhar or self-reliant in their own defense, and that is what brought in other states and caused the forming of alliances and brought America in this situation. And once again you find that these war clouds are hovering all over the world now. They are threatening all the rest of the world, mainly because Europe is not able to defend itself nor deal with its differences on its own. And the same Europe, the same Western world lectures the whole world in a way as if the rest of the world is responsible for all the problems that we keep having. So this is the first conflict in a long time which does not involve the Muslims, the Islamic world, terrorism, etc., etc. This is a conflict between sovereign states and alliances. Now NATO is talking, they are talking about Article 4. Article 4 is when they have security threat, they enter into immediate conversations. Article 5 means that if any NATO member is attacked, then it is seen as an attack on everybody. Now that has not come to pass yet because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. But Poland, which is the country which shares a big border with Ukraine, is a member of NATO, as are the Baltic republics, and all of them also have hostile relationships with Russia, so we don't know where that is headed. Now, as we track all this, I also notice other things. Sergei Utkin, who is one of the smartest Russia watchers, he is the head of strategic planning section at Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations at the Russian Academy of Sciences. So he's tweeted, and see his tweet, he's tweeted, "This is a catastrophe for Russia, Ukraine and beyond." And Shashank Joshi, a respected defense editor at The Economist, he has responded to that saying, among Russia's foreign policy watchers, the reaction is total shock. Next lesson is again that henceforth nobody will give up their nukes. In 1994, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, they signed the Budapest Memorandums of Security Guarantees and gave up their nuclear weapons. In fact, Ukraine had a very large stockpile of Soviet-era nuclear weapons. They gave those up in return for security guarantees from the US, Europe and most importantly, Russian Federation. In future now, nobody is going to give up their nuclear weapons. No Israel, no North Korea, no Iran, not nobody, because people have realized the perils if you give up your nuclear weapons after having them. In fact, this will now drive more and more countries to think about nuclear weapons as their final deterrents. Next, it will scare and subdue the Central Asian republics even more than they have been so far, because everybody is now seeing the consequences if you try to strike too independent or too sovereign a path. So former Soviet republics now will now see that there are limits to their sovereignty, and we'll know how the story goes, say with the Baltics, in the course of time.